Okay, I'm going to go over my code here for this exercise set 2 and just kind of help you see the layout of the code and how it all works together. This is kind of small probably on your screen, but I'm going to be zooming in on these different components so you can see it more clearly. But in general here, all the yellow boxes are CPP files and the blue boxes are .h files. Okay, and as a reminder, that .h does not stand for helper, it stands for header. Okay, so anytime you have a CPP file, you usually have a .h file that accompanies it with the same name. And that's true for every one of them except for the main.cpp, which usually just includes your main code there. Okay, so let me zoom in on this and we're going to walk around this code and just kind of see how it's structured. So we're going to start at the bottom here. This is main.cpp, and these lines show things that are included by these files. Okay, so main.cpp starts off by saying include arrow.h. Well, arrow.h is right here. This is the header file for the class. If you look inside of this, it's got a class arrow, public and private components here. But anyway, so that's the definition for this class. Okay, so main.cpp is including that header file, and then it's got this function, and all the function does is it says create a new arrow, so arrow star, that's declaring an object arrow, and call it my arrow. So this is the same as we would do with any new variable, right? Here's a new double variable called m time step. Well, here we're saying this is actually arrow star. It's a pointer to an arrow called my arrow. And when we create that, we have to pass in some information. And so we say that's equal to a new arrow, and then we're passing in this file name, the .json file name that includes all of the information about that arrow, like the aerodynamics and other things for the simulation. So anyway, that's just kind of input file information that we're going to pass in there. And we've got this arrow set up to accept a file name up here, a string file name. Okay, so that's what we're passing in there. And when it does that, this new command says actually create a new object and call it my arrow, and the object type is arrow, and give me the handle to that, and store it in this thing called my arrow. And then after you've created that object, which includes reading this file and parsing it out and setting all the variables for the simulation, then I say my arrow call exercise 2.2 and actually run this function. Okay, so let's go into the arrow.h file here. Again, this was the header file where we're declaring all of the information for this class. Okay, so we've got a class arrow, we've got a public. The very first function inside of that is our constructor, and when we create a new arrow, then they've got to pass in a string file name, which is exactly what we did here. They've got to pass in a string, and then we'll tell it what to do with that actually over here in the CPP file. So in the .h file, all we're doing is declaring all of our functions that reside within this class, functions and variables. And then over in the CPP file is where we actually do stuff with those functions and variables. Okay, so we've got public information here, private, and those functions and variables can be either public or private. The only public one we have is exercise 2.2, and that's why I can call it from CPP out here. I can call that function because it's a public function inside of this class. But I could not call any of these private functions. I've got 3 private functions, and I apologize that ran over from the previous line. But we've got 3 private ones here, and those are going to get called by this function here. So when I call exercise 2.2, this is now inside the class. It can call any of these private functions or any of the private variables that we have set up. So right here under private is where you would usually declare all member variables. So I've got just one example here, like a time step might be something that we need inside of this class. And then I've got a ... there showing that there are a bunch of other variables that we're going to need that are considered global variables within this class. So technically they're called member variables. That means that they're variables that reside inside of this class. And because these are private, I can't actually access any of these variables outside of the class. I can't access any of them in this code over here in my main function, but I can access them from anywhere inside of any of these functions here, public or private functions inside of the class can access any of these member variables. Okay, so this is the .h file. I mean, it's very simple because all it's doing is declaring what each of these functions is going to look like. And you can see I've got this RK422, RK4 function 22, and aerodynamics 22. So the flow of my code, and by the way, maybe I should jump over here first, in the CPP file is where the code for each of those actually resides. So this is the constructor function when they create a new arrow. This is where exercise 22 code would reside. This is where RK422 code, so here's the definition over here, RK422. We've got it over here, and then we put the actual code in here. And I didn't include the last two functions here, but these two functions, you know, we would add code down here at the bottom of the CPP file for those two functions there. Okay, so the way that my code is set up here is this main function is going to call, after it creates the arrow, then it's going to call the, well, maybe I should go back into the creation real quick. So when it creates that, it calls this constructor function, which let's go over here to the constructor function. This is where the code for that actually resides over in the CPP file. So it's going to take in a string file name, and this is where we would parse that using the JSON reader, parse out that input and actually store all of that information in these public variables that are accessible by any of the functions in this class. Okay, sorry, not public variables, they are member variables that are accessible to any of these functions. Okay, so they act kind of as global variables within this class. You know, within any of these functions, we can access any of these variables as kind of global variables. So anyway, that's where I would set all of those values, and then I can access those as I move through the other functions here. I can have access to all of that information. Okay, so anyway, let's go back here. So we create our arrow, and then we call exercise 22. That's going to call this function here, which is actually defined over here. So it's going to run the code that's inside of this. Now inside of this function is where I'm looping through my RK4 call. Okay, so this is going to initialize the arrow, the state of the arrow, and then it's going to loop through and call RK422 a whole bunch of times, once for each time step. Okay, so let me come back up here for a second. This is the public one, exercise 22, that's going to call RK422 over and over again, once for each time step. RK422 in turn is calling this function. I call it the RK4 function. This is really the dy dt function. This is your differential equation function that has 6 components in it for this particular example. So it's an array of length 6, but or the states are an array of length 6. But anyway, so it's gonna, the RK4 function here is gonna call this one 4 times. That's the definition of fourth order Rugged-Kutta. It's gonna call that function 4 times and estimate what the change of states is by calling it 4 times. That function depends on another function called aerodynamics22, because the change in the states here depends on the aerodynamics. And so the RK4 func22 here is actually going to call aerodynamics22 within it. And then, you know, the aerodynamics returns back to the RK4 func, and that returns back to the RK422, which then calls this again 4 times. Okay, so that's how the whole RK4 and the aerodynamics and everything work together here in the .h and the .cpp file. Now, in order to do this, there are a few functions that we need that don't necessarily need to reside inside of the class. They're just other functions that we need to have access to. For example, one of those is over here when we read in this file name, we needed to parse that using a JSON reader of some type. Okay, so that JSON reader is not specific to this arrow class. It's just a function that we need to have access to. We need to be able to call. Another example is inside of the aerodynamics, and also inside of this one here, we need to be able to call atmospheric information. We got to know what the density or whatever it is at a certain altitude, because we have the altitude of the aircraft or the air or whatever. We've got to call our atmospheric function in order to get that. Okay, so those are 2 examples of things that we would put in another file up here called a helper file. That's at least what I call mine, Hunsaker helper. Okay, and this is just a collection of useful functions that I might want to call at some point. And we're going to add to this list of all types of different functions that we can call outside of the classes, just helpful functions. Okay, so let's just walk through here. So again, we've got a helper.h file, and then and this is where we're going to define all of the functions and any variables or whatever that are global. Okay, and then over here in the CPP file is where we're actually going to put the code in for what each of those functions does. Okay, so I've got enter code here for each of these functions. All right, so let's just walk through this. So this has this is where I do my general include statements of all the different types of functionality that I'm going to want in my code. So IOStream, FStream, functional, CMath, and I'm also including this JSON.hpp that's going to allow me to read JSON files and parse them. Using namespace standard here, that's something I like to have at the top of my code so that I don't have to do the std : anytime I'm calling something within that. And then using JSON, this is again just kind of another global statement so that I can just call JSON later, and it knows that it's using this namespace. I believe that's what that's called. So C++, I'm not really familiar with how namespaces work, but anyway, I know that by putting this code here, I can now just call JSON and have access to the stuff inside of this JSON HPP. Okay, so here's a definition of a variable, a struct atmosphere that, or variable type that I'm going to want to use later, called it atmosphere. So I can create atmospheres just like I create doubles or strings or whatever. I just have to say, I've got an atmosphere named XYZ or whatever, and it will create a struct that has all of this information inside of it for me, and then I can set those values individually. Okay, so I'm just defining that struct there, and then I'm defining each of these functions. So I've got two gravity functions that will give it to me in either SI or English units, and then atmospheric property functions that I pass in an altitude, and it sends back actually all of the atmospheric data in a struct like this, so I can pull out whatever I want, and I've got one for SI and one for English. Okay, so again in the .h file, I'm just declaring what these are. I'm just specifying that these exist, and then it's in the .cpp file that also includes the .h file that I actually tell these include the code to actually fill out these functions. What these functions actually do. Okay, so let me just zoom back out now that we've gone through that in detail. Hopefully you can see from this structure. So main only includes the arrow.h. Arrow.h includes the Hunsaker helper, and Hunsaker helper includes everything else that I need, basically. And so this is the way that I like to structure my code to try to keep it kind of clean, because if I've included it in Hunsaker helper, then I have access to it anywhere downstream. Okay, so anything that's in Hunsaker helper or included by Hunsaker helper, I can access now in Arrow or main CPP, because those are including, in this chain, they go up the chain and include everything above it. Okay, and then the CPP files basically stick out here to the side where the actual code for any of these functions or for the class go to fill out what all of that stuff does. These are just, the blue files again are just definitions of each of these functions or variables that are going to be used within the class, or these global functions that I can access anywhere. Okay, so hopefully that gives you an idea of how this code is structured, and you can organize that in your mind a little bit better for this project.